So today I'm going to build an upper cabinet for my pantry that is going to go over the wine refrigerator, and it's going to house wine. I'm using these 3-wheeled rollers. Put the plywood on it, wheel it in. If I can get around the corner. There we go. I used my track saw first to cut a 4x8 sheet of plywood down to manageable sizes. Then I used my table saw to cut the shelves and sides. I started the assembly process by attaching 2 shelves to one side, but then I went back to the drawing board and decided to start over. Part of building stuff is not being afraid to undo something and redo it if you decide that you would like it better another way. Great. I started out this time by focusing on my stemware storage shelf. I first ripped some poplar to size for dividers and spines, and then used my drum sander to make sure they were all the same thickness. Then I used my handy router table that was a pain in the ass to put together, and routed a profile on each side of each divider. Then I glued the spines onto the dividers. I used a combination square to make sure that each spine was exactly centered in the divider. Glue on its own would have been just fine, but I shot some nails in for good measure. Once that was dry, I sanded the inner dividers and spines, and then everything got coated with primer and paint. It would have been much harder to do this step after the whole shelf was put together, so I made sure that I did it beforehand. Now it's time to reassemble that cabinet. It's basically the same as it was before, except I moved the location of the bottom shelf to give myself a little more height. I originally was not going to do dados at all. I was just going to butt join the spines onto the shelf. But then I decided it would be too difficult to keep everything lined up. So I routed some dados, whatever. Just a little glue, and then these thingamajiggies get set into place. Some of them needed a little encouragement, but it all worked out in the end. I used a long T-square to mark the location of each divider so I would know where to put some screws. I didn't want to rely just on glue. I put a couple screws in each divider and called it good. All right, so now I finally got this built and painted the inside. In hindsight, I mean, I wasn't planning on doing dados, so I would not paint this first if you're gonna do dados. Cut your dados and then paint. But yeah, whatever, it's done. I gave the whole thing a good sanding and then covered all the screw holes and the front edge of the plywood with my favorite wood patch. Now I'm creating an X to put in the top compartment. I started out by cutting 2 boards with the proper angles, inserted each board on the opposing diagonals halfway into the cabinet and marked the intersection. Then I used my table saw set to an angle that was determined by my markings, and I cut halfway through each board. Now, I wasn't sure if it was going to actually work or not, so I dry fit before I primed and painted everything. Luckily, it did, so I took the shelves back out. Before I painted, everything had to be sanded. So I sanded everything well, then primed and sanded again before I painted. TD-us. And not fun at all. I gave my paint plenty of time to dry. Then it was time to install the stemware shelf. I just used screws and screwed it directly in from the side. I used 3 screws per side. Then it was time to install the X. It took a little more effort this time around because the paint had added a little volume. My arm was a little tired after 5 minutes, but I got it and celebrated accordingly. Now to square up. Sometimes it's a hard task. Bingo! Sometimes it's easy. Okay, gently put this in place. So I'll flank, that's it. Now that the back is screwed in, it will hold the sides together. So I can take this out, see if I can do it without scratching.
Obviously, I'm not done. I have to put on the face frame, and before I do that, I have to build the upper cabinet up there. So I'm going to do that next. Why don't you join me back here next time for that segment.